In 1871, a famous English artist enjoyed the happiest summer of his life. In July that year, he left his home in London and set off for Kelmscott Manor in Gloucestershire. Accompanying him was his beloved mistress. Not only was she a married woman, she was married to his friend. In the weeks that followed, the two lovers took advantage of the idyllic rural setting and the fact that her husband was out of the country to revel in their passionate affair. The lovers were Jane Morris, wife of the English socialist William Morris, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. At the time, Rossetti was 43 years old, successful and famous. Though he chose not to exhibit in public, his finest works were well known to the connoisseur. Rossetti was admired for his medieval watercolors and for his many pictures of beautiful women. He was also appreciated for his work as a poet. But he was perhaps best known for his role in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a secret society whose bold aim was to free the British artist from the shallow conservatism of academic painting. Ultimately, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood fell apart, and this would also be the fate of its most famous member. After his idyllic summer in Gloucestershire, Rossetti's health and mind deteriorated rapidly. He had always been a complex, sensitive man, whose relationships with women had often led to terrible traumas. His liaison with Jane Morris was no exception. Rossetti turned to drink and drugs to deal with his problems, and it was these addictions that led to his death at the age of just 53. But the work he left behind is a timeless testimony to his achievements in life.
Rossetti's achievement was to bring together a group of people who were really quite different, I think, in their outlook, and then to really develop something which was quite different to the early Pre-Raphaelitism. No narrative necessarily, something which was a dream, a fantasy, something which fits into the wider movement of symbolism.
Rossetti was the most imaginative of the Pre-Raphaelites, and I think his main achievement was really the creation of the image that we associate most with the Pre-Raphaelites, and that is the Pre-Raphaelite woman, the idealised woman when we see her with these sort of long limbs, the one face, the flowing hair. And what I think is interesting about her is that she's a sort of mixture of saint and sinner. She's partly based on the images of the medieval romances. She's partly a woman of the street. She has an enigma about her. You can find her in symbolism amongst the symbolist poets and painters. She's one of these enduring, enigmatic images.
He, in a way, was an independent artist. His art reflected that very deep romantic vision that he was able to generate within himself. In fact, he had very few genuine people who could emulate what he did. He had many imitators, but none of them were really able to have that force of vision that he himself was able to create.
Dante Gabriel Rossetti was born on May the 12th, 1828, in the city that would be his lifelong home, London. He was the second of 4 children, born into a family of Italian exiles. It was an intellectual household. Dante's father was professor of Italian at King's College London, and his children were also high achievers. Christina found fame as a poet, and William as an art critic. Dante was also a successful poet, but it was clear from his youth that art was his true passion. It is said that his early love of drawing was so strong that his destiny as an artist was never in doubt. At the age of 9, he became a pupil at his father's school, where art lessons were part of the curriculum. Aged 14, he moved on to the well-known London art school known as Sasse's, and 3 years later became a student at the Royal Academy. It was an orthodox artistic upbringing, but the young Rossetti hated it. He did not respond to discipline of any kind and gained a reputation as a romantic free spirit. As this 1847 self-portrait may reveal. This is the image of an attractive young man on the point of entry into adult life. It is also a more than competent work of art. But at the time it was drawn, Rossetti was still considering a career in poetry. So he wrote to the famous poet and critic Leigh Hunt, asking for advice. When Hunt replied that it was easier to survive as a painter than as a poet, Rossetti decided to earn his living as an artist, but he never gave up poetry completely. By writing to Leigh Hunt, the young Rossetti revealed his bold self-confidence. This was apparent again in March 1848, when he wrote to the painter Ford Madox Brown, asking to be taken on as a pupil. Rossetti paid Brown so many compliments that he assumed the young man was having a joke at his expense. Immediately, he rushed round to the Rossetti home armed with a club to teach the joker a lesson. Only then did he realize that the young artist was genuine. So, in the summer of 1848, Rossetti became a student at Brown's studio. But their master-pupil relationship would be brief. The rebellious Rossetti found formal training by Brown to be just as hard as that on offer at the Academy. But it was the Academy that Rossetti disliked most. He saw it as a conservative institution that championed the dull, conservative painting dominating the British art market. Rossetti hated this worthy academic approach, and he found two fellow students who shared his view: John Everett Millais and William Holman Hunt.
Rossetti, Hunt and Millais had in common was really the things they disliked. They disliked the materialism of the modern world. They disliked the pedantry of the Academy. They disliked all the painters who would do pictures of glossy animals and pretty women and people like that. And so I think it was really more that they were reacting against something, and this was the idea to move away from something. They were more united by that than they were by some other common ideal.
The PRB painters felt that art needed to be revitalised. It needed to go back to a more simple form of presentation. They looked back to artists whose work was more from the Quattrocento school, the pre-Raphaelite painters. And Raphael was regarded as the epitome of art at the time, the artist who one should emulate. It was a revolutionary art movement that wanted to sweep away the kind of painting that people had become used to.
There was some argument about what they were going to call themselves, some discussion, I should say. One of the first suggestions was that they should call themselves early Christian artists, I think it was. But this was put to one side because it was too religious, really, a title. What they were doing by choosing that title was saying that they were deliberately looking back to a period in art which was heartfelt, truthful, something which went to nature, observing minutely, closely everything, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing.
To keep the society a secret, they decided to refer to it by the initials of its name, and we can see these initials on Rossetti's first great oil painting, The Girlhood of Mary Virgin, P.R.B.
Every bit of that painting has some kind of meaning, not just the figure of Mary herself, who of course is Christina Rossetti, his sister. It's the dove, it's the lily, it's the books, it's all those different things which will tell you about the nature of Mary, her character. She's wearing grey, she's seated in profile, she's looking in a very kind of demure, very modest way, as you would expect. She is not showing any particular emotion. It's a very quiet image. It's an image of ideal femininity, and it's one that fits in very well, I suppose, to a Victorian idea about what women were about at the time.
The colouring is bright and vivid, and there is a strong element of symbolism whose meaning is revealed in 2 Rossetti poems, which were attached to the frame of the canvas. All through his life, Rossetti continued to accompany his visual art with verse.
First and foremost, Rossetti was as much a poet as he was a painter. He saw, I think, the two things as interchangeable. The idea of creating an image which was both a visual image and a poetic image all in one together became a natural course for him, so that he would construct frames and put his poetry on the frame, and he would construct images that reflected his poetic ideas. So this was all part and parcel of the same thing as far as he was concerned.
He was somebody who was absolutely enthused by poetry, by Italian poetry, by the poetry of Dante and Boccaccio, by the English poetry of Keats, for example. He's trying to bring out certain narratives and feelings which may not necessarily always be there in the painting itself. It's interesting to me that, of course, he was looking at Blake early on, and I think that kind of romantic interrelationship between text and image is something which is very peculiar to Rossetti. It's not unusual for artists to put text into their paintings or to put text into the frames of paintings, but Rossetti does it in a more sustained way.
In 1849, at the age of 20, Rossetti showed The Girlhood of Mary Virgin at London's Free Exhibition, and it sold for 80 guineas. His career was now underway, and so was the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. In late 1849, the expanding society began to publish its own journal, known as The Germ, which provided an outlet for Rossetti's poetry. Early in 1850, he began his next project in paint, The Annunciation. But before the canvas was ready for exhibiting in the spring, the meaning of the mysterious initials PRB leaked out into London's art establishment. The result was little short of an outrage.
When the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was revealed to the world, when people found out what this PRB meant that they were sticking on their pictures, it was really quite a shock, quite a horrified response. I think this was because it was in 1848 and it was a time of revolution in Europe, and they were seen as a kind of subversive group. In Britain in particular, this was also associated with religious fears. Britain was still a Protestant country, basically, and there were fears that Catholicism was gaining ground again. Their interest in medieval art was associated in many people's eyes with Catholicism, and this was another thing that caused people to fear them, in effect. They seemed to be a subversive element.
1848 was, to put it mildly, a difficult year, a year of European revolution. It was a time when there was upheaval, a time of Chartism, a time when secret brotherhoods were not the most sensible thing to form if you were wanting to make a name for yourself in the art world.
The criticism unleashed upon the young men of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was severe, and Rossetti took it especially badly. After the exhibition of this second canvas, he decided never to show his work in public again. This dramatic reaction was in spite of the fact that it was almost certainly Rossetti himself who let slip the meaning of the PRB initials. His fellow brothers were annoyed with him, and their displeasure was only increased by Rossetti's decision to show The Annunciation at the Free Exhibition rather than at the Academy, which they felt was the true battleground for their movement.
The Annunciation is a very important moment in early Pre-Raphaelitism. It's a very white painting. The Virgin herself is kind of shrinking back and looking concerned. I think it was William Michael Rossetti who said that, of course, she's on the bed, but she doesn't have bedclothes because of the hot climate. So it's a truthful representation of how Mary would actually have heard the news, not receiving it with absolute equanimity, but actually being frightened and disturbed by it.
You can see how the Virgin is crouched up on the bed at the back. She's full of fear as the angel comes towards her. And of course, traditionally, the Virgin is full of fear when the angel comes. But he turns it into a psychological fear, almost a sexual fear. This is somebody being told that she is going to have a baby. And you feel there is a sense of loss of virginity in the picture. Something that contrasts, of course, with the virginal white of the whole effect. It is a picture about the loss of virginity. And he pulls that side of the story out, which is very original in that kind of religious work. But it is quite remarkable for its time, for being a picture that's so much about colour effect, pure colour effect. As well as all those wonderful areas of white, you have pure blue and pure red, you have the primary colours, and the whole thing has a very elegant, long, thin design.
The Annunciation was shown in April 1850, and by now, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was crumbling as its members began to pursue their own ideas. For Rossetti, this meant turning to the medium of watercolour. Using a heavy application of paint, he began to create a succession of small, strongly coloured images inspired by medieval subjects. In particular, the life and work of the great Italian writer whose Christian name he shared, Dante Alighieri. But of all Rossetti's Dante watercolours, perhaps the greatest is the first anniversary of the death of Beatrice.
The picture of Dante on the first anniversary of the death of Beatrice is a kind of image of Dante's life in general. Rossetti was a great admirer of Dante. He more or less modelled himself on Dante. He shows Dante painting a picture of an angel, which he was apparently doing on the anniversary of the death of his beloved, and that is shown. But also in the picture we see signs of his active life. There's a crossbow hanging on the easel, signs of his poetic life as well. So one has the idea of him as a man of action and a man of poetry, and as also as a person steeped in medieval romantic love.
Rossetti was actually christened Gabriel Charles Dante Rossetti. He wasn't christened Dante Gabriel Rossetti. His father had a lifelong obsession with Dante, and so christened his eldest son, gave him the name Dante. He felt that he was almost like reliving Dante's life.
One would feel that in a lot of ways Rossetti takes Dante as a kind of model. But I think at the same time he must have been aware that he wasn't really at all like Dante, and that although he liked to sort of clothe himself in the poetry and romance of Dante, he was really a very different person. Dante was a very religious person. He was a very stern person. He was a powerful politician for a time. He was a public figure in the way that Rossetti wasn't. So there are many aspects of Dante that Rossetti really didn't share at all, but he did enjoy the idea of Dante.
The first anniversary of the death of Beatrice was the painting that first brought Rossetti to the attention of the famous critic and theorist John Ruskin. And commissions provided by Ruskin included this 1855 image of Beatrice meeting Dante at a marriage feast. The great Italian himself can be seen in the background of a mysterious picture, which again captured the admiration of John Ruskin.
Ruskin coming into the defence of the Pre-Raphaelite with his letter to the Times and then his pamphlet on Pre-Raphaelitism was an extraordinary moment. That meant that they had got behind them somebody who was a real force, who could really act as a mouthpiece for them and refute other criticisms coming in. So to get Ruskin's backing was very, very useful at this particular juncture.
For his paintings of the human figure, Rossetti typically used models drawn from his circle of family and friends, a custom that would remain with him throughout his professional life. In his first two oil paintings, the Virgin was modelled by his sister Christina. In his 1850s watercolours, it was his lover whose features he depicted time and time again. This was Lizzie Siddal, a London shopgirl who met Rossetti around 1850. Here we can see Lizzie Siddal as the girl who inspired a passion in Dante very similar to that experienced by the artist named after him. Lizzie can also be seen in this watercolour completed in the same year. Here she represents Rachel in another scene inspired by the work of Dante. Rossetti was not the only artist to know her, but it was Rossetti who became Lizzie's long-term partner. By 1854, the unmarried couple were living together in London. It was an unusual relationship. Rossetti obviously adored the girl whom he referred to as Guggums, but his love was somehow idealized. It was as if he couldn't bring himself to relate physically to the object of his desire. Throughout the 1850s, watercolour paintings like this secured Rossetti a growing circle of admirers. But his developing career was not without its setbacks. This canvas, depicting a fallen woman and her former lover, represents Rossetti's only attempt at depicting contemporary subject matter. The artist's failings in perspective are obvious, and Rossetti never completed the work. The 1850s also saw him struggling with debt, in spite of Ruskin's often generous financial support. So in 1854, as a favour, Rossetti agreed to teach art at the Working Men's College in Oxford, where Ruskin was also a teacher. However, Rossetti was as unsuccessful as a teacher as he had been as a student. On those occasions when he did turn up for classes, he simply ignored technical disciplines like perspective that he struggled with himself. But the 4 years that he taught in Oxford were significant, for it was around these medieval buildings that he met 3 important new associates. Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris were 2 undergraduate friends at Oxford who had started a literary magazine together. They were also admirers of Rossetti's work. Burne-Jones wrote in praise of the first anniversary of the death of Beatrice, while Morris was passionate about this 1854 watercolour, a medieval scene inspired not by Dante, but by the tales of Arthurian legend. Here we see Lancelot and Guinevere meeting for the last time beside King Arthur's tomb. At the time, the Arthur tales were hugely popular in England. The works of Tennyson contributed strongly to this, and it was Tennyson's work that inspired a remarkable Rossetti image from 1859. With this watercolour depicting Sir Galahad at the ruined chapel, the artist's mastery as a colourist may have reached its most dramatic expression.
Rossetti's painting of Sir Galahad does have wonderfully rich colours in it, and it has almost the effect of a tapestry in some ways. Rossetti was very fond, as we know, of medieval art, medieval design, and he used to like to have both colours that were vivid but deep, so they had a sort of deep richness to them, and they tended to be interwoven. You can see the colours turning up again in different parts of the pictures. So I think it is the sort of wonderful sort of harmonies that he creates that is so important.
Rossetti's enthusiasm for Arthurian subjects was short-lived, more or less coinciding with his years teaching in Oxford. On the whole, this was a happy time for him, as he shared his passion for all things medieval with his friends Burne-Jones and Morris. It was during his time in Oxford that Rossetti met the girl who would become the true love of his life, Jane Burden. In time, his feelings for her would consume his entire being, and she would inspire many of his greatest paintings. But in 1859, Rossetti found himself back in London full-time, where he continued to live with his beloved Lizzie. He also began a relationship with Fanny Cornforth, another London woman who would feature in his paintings. She too sat for many Rossetti works, including this intriguing picture. Bocca Basciata was nominally inspired by the work of the medieval poet Boccaccio. It marked his return to oil painting and reveals his talent for creating images of beautiful women.
The Kissed Mouth does act as a prelude to an obsessive treatment of the subject of woman in his painting, which lasts until the end of his life. It's responding to a demand for that kind of painting again. You could see it as a pre-Raphaelite response to the keepsake picture, a picture of a pretty woman. But of course, Rossetti fills the frame with his images of women, the head and the shoulder. If there's anything in the background, it's close packed. So they're crowding in on you, as you would see almost a face in a dream. And I think it would not be wrong to see his continuing taking of chloral, of drugs, as something which produces this kind of repetitive, obsessive image.
By the time Rossetti reached middle age, his artistic output consisted of nothing but pictures of women. But in the early 1860s, his subject matter was still diverse. This religious scene was painted for Llandaff Cathedral in Wales. It was the only public commission of Rossetti's life, and its main interest may lie in the figure who the artist chose to depict as Mary. This is Jane Burden, the woman from Oxford who was married by the time this image was completed in 1864. Her husband was Rossetti's friend, William Morris. At the time, the two men were still close. Rossetti's feelings for Jane had not yet affected their friendship. In 1860, Rossetti painted this strange image for Morris' own home, the so-called Red House. Here we can see Lizzie Siddal, Rossetti's first love, who became his wife around the time this painting was completed. It would not be a happy marriage. For many years, Lizzie suffered from an unusual illness, which may have been a reaction to Rossetti's philandering lifestyle. Marriage did nothing to improve her condition. She grew increasingly depressed and turned to the opiate drug laudanum for relief. In May 1861, she gave birth to a stillborn child. 9 months later, she was dead, killed by an overdose of laudanum. Officially, it was an accident. In reality, suicide was the far more likely cause of death.
10th of February 1862, he and Lizzie went out to have dinner with the poet Swinburne. Later in the evening, he and Lizzie came home. She seemed apparently to be all right, so he went out again later on in the evening. It's thought that he actually went out to see another one of his models and another one of his mistresses called Fanny Cornforth.
He leaves her to go out. He leaves her very tired, and he comes back and finds her, well, I suppose in a coma. And despite calling a doctor, despite her having her stomach pumped, she dies. And she dies of an overdose of laudanum, which is, of course, an opiate.
She was very miserable towards the end of her life. She knew that Rossetti was having affairs with Fanny Cornforth and other people. She felt isolated. She was also physically in bad health. She was consumptive, and she felt that, I suppose, nothing was going forward in her life. And it may just simply have been an overdose, but it looks more likely that it was a suicide, and it was a suicide because of the neglect of Rossetti.
Whatever the cause of Lizzie's death, her husband was profoundly affected. As a gesture, he decided that all the poetry he had ever written should be buried alongside her in London's Highgate Cemetery. But in 1869, he took the difficult decision to dig up Lizzie's grave to recover the poems that he had buried alongside her. He had decided that his work should be published after all, but the publication created more problems than it solved. One particularly strong critical reaction to his anthology left him deeply depressed, and he turned towards drink and drugs to drown his sorrows. Shortly after Lizzie's death, Rossetti moved to a new home in London's Chelsea district. He also spent time working for the firm established by his friend William Morris. This was an enterprise inspired by the tradition of the medieval craft guilds. Established in 1861, Morris and Company united a group of artists whose intention was to provide decorations, paintings, metalwork, sculptures, anything that could be commissioned. Among the artists involved were Rossetti and his friends Burne-Jones and Madox Brown, and the firm was launched with high hopes of success. In reality, Morris and Company did little more than design stained glass in its early years. Rossetti produced some 30 designs, including this 1862 Sermon on the Mount for a church in Gloucestershire. But the artist could not commit himself fully to design work. He was now 34 years of age, and for the rest of his life, it was paintings of beautiful women that absorbed his attention, to the virtual exclusion of anything else. Many of these depicted his mistress, Fanny Cornforth. In The Blue Bower, from 1865, we see her set against a background of intricately patterned design. We can also see a bold compositional layout in The Beloved. With this canvas, Rossetti sought to arrange the component figures in the shape of a rose. The Beloved herself forms the centre of the flower, with her attendants arranged around her like petals. Some critics have argued that the overall effect is technically flawed, and it would be an unlikely master who would use this canvas in a lesson for teaching the art of perspective. But it is difficult not to admire the colour, beauty and freshness of a painting that remains amongst the best-known pictures of the artist's career. With pictures like this, and this equally famous work, the Monna Vanna, Rossetti created timeless images of femininity that reflected his own longing for the ideal female figure.
I think Rossetti's paintings of women are most striking because of the combination that it has of the saint and the sinner. It is the extraordinary mixture, the image that later on gets taken up by the symbolists and used as the image of the femme fatale.
I admire the technical skill of them. I think they are wonderful. The way in which he can really convey the idea of a richness of surface, a pearliness of skin, a particular sheen on the hair, and contrast that with an exotic, strange costume. The image they provide of women is really of a woman as an object, of a woman as a beautiful flower, a woman as a troublesome being.
It's a fantasy, obviously, it's a fantasy. And in some ways, it's a very oppressive fantasy. Once one thinks of the history of the Pre-Raphaelites, think of the tragic life of Lizzie Siddal, think of Jane Morris, these people were turned into these idealised figures, and you feel they didn't have much say in the matter.
When this image was completed in 1866, its painter was an increasingly wealthy man. The canvas itself gives us an indication of this. The model is Alexa Wilding, a London girl who Rossetti was able to employ on an annual retainer fee. His works now sold for hundreds of pounds. In 1867 alone, he earned £3,000. Remarkably, he was still in debt. This partly derived from his love of collecting objects. Antique furniture and Chinese porcelain were just two of his passions. He also built up a menagerie of wild animals that included buffalo, deer, peacocks, raccoons, and, most bizarrely of all, a wombat, for whom the artist developed a genuine affection. But there was another, darker reason for Rossetti's debts. He was already a heavy drinker, and in the later 1860s he began to turn to drugs. To help him sleep, he took chloral hydrate, an anesthetic that did him far more harm than good. As early as 1867, he began to exhibit signs of paranoia. He also became convinced that he was going blind, despite the reassurance of his doctors. He still mourned for his dead wife, and his grief found expression in his art. This is the remarkable Beata Beatrix, another painting nominally inspired by the lover of the medieval Dante. But there can be no doubt that this intense image represents Rossetti's final farewell to his wife.
It was like the way of creating a monument to his life with Lizzie. And the painting itself is one of his most intense. It's got a thick, luscious kind of quality, and it's a very sort of rich, glowing painting.
The figure of Beatrice in the foreground, and you have the figure of Love and Dante to either side of her in the background, with a view, of course, of Florence in the far distance. The painting is obviously about Elizabeth Siddal's death. The fact that she is being shown at the moment that she moves from earth to heaven, that kind of ecstatic moment of release of the soul from the body, is obviously about death, and the reference to the poppy is obviously about laudanum, and there's no question. All the documentary evidence is that this is a painting about Elizabeth Siddal.
As the years went by, Rossetti became increasingly obsessed with Jane, the wife of his friend William Morris. Many suspect that Rossetti had encouraged Morris to marry, so that Jane could remain close to his own circle. When the Morrises moved to a new London home in 1865, it meant that Jane and Rossetti were physically closer than ever. Jane posed for Rossetti on many occasions, and with portraits such as Reverie from 1868, the artist hardly disguised his feelings for the sitter. But we can also identify a recurring feature of Rossetti's art. With images like this, and the dramatic Study for Pandora of 1869, we can see his mastery of a highly technical aspect of portraiture: the painting of hands.
Whenever he produced paintings of women, we can see that he always produced images where they had very long, elegant fingers, and their hands were very elegantly portrayed. And hands within themselves are very good at expressing personality.
The portrayal of female hands in the later paintings, particularly those which feature Jane Burden, Jane Morris, is the extraordinary way in which they are convoluted. They often appear to be hands that are being wrung, hands that are always tense. They are not still. They're not peaceful hands. They become part of a kind of almost abstraction of form that goes on with the body in his later works, where the figures become monumental and the hands are acting as kind of gestural moments against that.
By the time the 1870s dawned, Rossetti had become a master at painting female hands, and it was the hands of Jane Morris that he painted time and again, in pictures such as Mariana. The true nature of the relationship between artist and his favourite sitter was now obvious to many, including Jane's husband, William. Fearful of public scandal in London, he made a decision that may seem unusual. In early 1871, he took a joint lease on a fine country home in Gloucestershire, Kelmscott Manor. His partner in the lease was Rossetti. Remarkably, in the summer of that year, William Morris left England and sailed for distant Iceland. Back at Kelmscott, his so-called friend was able to indulge his passion for his wife. With Morris out of the picture, Rossetti enjoyed the time of his life. His health problems suddenly left him, and he spent his days walking, lazing around, and reading Shakespeare with his lover.
Morris and Rossetti took on the lease of Kelmscott Manor basically because they wanted to get away. You might say both of them were going through some kind of midlife crisis. Morris had been running his firm for some time. It had not been going terribly well, and soon after taking on Kelmscott, he did finally reform the firm and make it into a more commercial organisation, and an extremely successful one. Rossetti had been declining over the last decade. He'd rather lost his way. The death of Lydie Siddal had shaken him considerably. Perhaps he wanted to get away from London. He wanted to try again.
Kelmscott Manor was a beautiful house. It was a place where I think they both in their own way thought they would find peace and be able to work, most importantly, and be able to produce the kind of artwork that was important to them. So it was a shift, but it was a working environment, I think, as much as anything else. A beautiful place to live, to be, but also a place in which to work.
In autumn 1871, Rossetti returned to London. He was now more successful than ever, as this contemporary painting indicates. This is Dante's Dream at the time of the death of Beatrice, one of the very few later Rossetti works without an exclusively feminine subject matter. At 10 foot by 7, it was the largest work of the artist's career, and its commission was worth over £1,500. At least, it would have been if the buyer had not refused it because the size of the canvas went against his wishes. In the end, Dante's Dream was bought by someone else, and Rossetti seemed to be untroubled by the whole affair. But real problems were now looming. Just weeks after his idyllic summer, Rossetti was plunged into despair and depression. In June 1872, he took an overdose of laudanum. Though he survived, the 44-year-old artist was now an increasingly pathetic figure. His addiction to chloral hydrate had reached desperate proportions, and the false comforts of the whiskey bottle only accelerated his decline. Increasingly, he found it difficult to work. But when he did, the results were as impressive as ever. For this 1874 canvas, he chose to depict the mythical figure of Proserpina. But we can see immediately that this is yet another study in the features of his lover, Jane Morris.
In something like Proserpine, for example, where the figure is standing against that shaft of light coming from the upper earth, the hands are kind of turned in on the body and holding a pomegranate, fruit of death. It's not an illustration to text, and text isn't an explanation of image. It's the visual and the written coming together at one moment, which is, I think, very important. A lot of the imagery that Rossetti uses in his poems is extraordinarily visual. It's the imagery of a painter anyway. So there is an absolute correspondence, if you like, between the two art forms.
This 1877 canvas reveals a similar inspiration. Here we see Astarte Syriaca, the love goddess of the Syrians as posed for by Jane. It remains one of the most memorable works of the artist's career and was recognized as such when it was completed. It is ironic that as Rossetti's health declined, his works sold for greater sums than ever before. The businessman who bought this imposing image paid a price of £2,100 for what turned out to be a final masterpiece.
Astarte Syriaca is one of the grandest of Rossetti's late pictures. It's a picture which is based on Jane Morris. She is the model, and she's shown as a very powerful figure there. She's meant to be this Assyrian goddess, and she seems to have some of that kind of power, a little bit like the Mona Lisa, somebody who sort of knows all the evils of the world and has a face that is full of sorrow as well as full of beauty. And perhaps that image of a sort of a tragic heroine, to a certain extent, comes across in this picture, and the almost rather sort of beefy image that she has of sort of, she's very powerful but also very beautiful and very beautifully formed.
A few months after this wonderful image was completed, the career of Dante Gabriel Rossetti came to an end. The year was 1878, and, afflicted by shingles, he was physically unable to work. For 4 more years, the once attractive artist lingered on, abandoned by his friends, overweight, sick, depressed, and addicted. Death in February 1882 put an end to his suffering. But this stricken old man is not what we remember when we consider Dante Gabriel Rossetti. In his 30 years of productive life, he created a magnificent body of work. From his early pre-Raphaelite paintings to his medieval watercolours to his dozens of female beauties, the work of Rossetti was one of the finest artistic achievements of the 19th century.
He absolutely stands alone as a person who has a very intense personal vision, especially when he painted women. He became very divorced in the sense from the pre-Raphaelite movement per se, and his art became much more akin to the symbolist movement. There were a great many followers that took up his ideas into symbolism and into modernism generally.
I think his watercolours are some of the most beautiful works produced in the mid-century in this country, and they have a particular quality to them which is both fresh, and it's also, I think, they are truly, in the best sense of the word, pre-Raphaelite.
Ultimately, Rossetti is a painter of the imagination, and that perhaps is the most admirable thing. By which I don't mean that he has no visual effects. He's a very visual artist, he has some wonderful visual effects, but you feel that his pictures are ones in which you can engage imaginatively, you can think in front of them, you can respond to them, and there's this intriguing mixture of ancient and modern, that sense of the romantic image from the Middle Ages, and that is brought out, I think, in the way that the colours are woven together. There's this tremendous richness, a richness of fabric in the pictures themselves, which makes him, I think, in the end, the most enduring of the Pre-Raphaelites.